Imagine handing your baby to a stranger at a train station in exchange for a few coins and a promise. No contract, no address you could trust. Just a woman with a kind face who told you she'd raised 6 of her own and that yours would be safe. In parts of Victorian England, this happened every single week, sometimes every single day, and for many of those babies, that handshake on the platform was the last safe moment of their short lives. Hi friends. Tonight, we're going somewhere quiet and somewhere sad, but somewhere true. If you're the kind of person who likes to understand the past exactly as it was, gentle edges and all, then settle in. This is one of those stories. Go ahead and dim the lights. If you haven't already, pull a blanket up over your knees. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Wherever you are tonight, you're safe, you're warm, and nothing in this story can reach you here. It's simply a story now, a memory of people who lived and loved and struggled a long time ago. Let's begin. Picture a narrow street in London, somewhere behind the grand shopping avenues the tourists know. The date doesn't matter much. Call it the 1870s. The air smells of coal smoke and boiled cabbage and the particular dampness of English brick that never quite dries. Rain has fallen for 3 days straight, soft and steady, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder, just quietly soaks into everything. Somewhere in one of these houses, behind a curtain the color of weak tea, a young woman named, well, let's call her Eliza, because so many women in this story went unnamed by the world, though not by the people who loved them, sits with a baby against her chest. She is not married. In 1870s England, that single fact could end a life as surely as any illness. Not her life, exactly, her old life. The one where she had a position as a lady's maid, a small room of her own, a wage of perhaps £12 a year, and a future that looked, if not exciting, at least steady. That life ended the moment her employer noticed she was expecting. You have to understand something about service work in this era, and it helps to think of it less as a job and more as an entire way of living. A servant's room was her home. A servant's employer controlled not just her wages, but her reputation, her references, her ability to ever work again. And an unmarried pregnant servant was, in the eyes of nearly every respectable household, a stain that needed removing quickly, quietly, before it touched the family's good name. So Eliza was let go. No notice period softened it. No severance cushioned it. Just a small case packed in an afternoon. A cold reference, if she was given one at all, and a door closing behind her. 6 months later, she is a mother, and she still needs to work. Because in Victorian England, there was no safety net beneath a woman like her. No allowance from the parish that would let her stay home with her child and still eat. If she wanted to survive, truly survive, in the sense of having food and a roof, she had to earn a wage, and no employer in the entire city would take a woman with a baby in her arms. This is the quiet mathematics that built the baby farming trade. Not villainy at first. Arithmetic. Listen to the numbers for a moment, because they tell the story better than any adjective could. A domestic servant's wage might run somewhere between £10 and £20 a year. Call it 4 to 8 shillings a week, once you allow for room and board being provided elsewhere. A woman paying someone to keep her child, meanwhile, might pay anywhere from 3 shillings a week for a modest arrangement, up to 10 or even 20 shillings for what were advertised as adoptions. A single lump sum, paid once, in exchange for the carer taking the child permanently off the mother's hands. £10, paid once, so you never have to think about the weekly cost again. £10, and the promise, spoken but never verified, that your child would be loved. You can hear how tempting that math becomes when you are a woman standing in the rain with no other options in front of you. So Eliza does what tens of thousands of women did in this era. She opens a newspaper, perhaps the Morning Post, or one of the smaller weeklies that carried what were politely called the wanted, a good home notices. And she reads through a column of advertisements that all say roughly the same thing. A respectable married woman wishes to adopt a child. Every care and attention, terms moderate. There is a particular sound to newspaper pages in a cold room, a dry, papery rustle, the kind that seems louder than it should be when a house is otherwise silent. Eliza runs her finger down the column. Somewhere outside, a coal cart rattles over cobblestones, and a dog barks twice and goes quiet again. She circles one advertisement, a Mrs. Wilkins, of a modest street not too far away, married. Respectable. Terms moderate. She writes a letter. Now, before we go further into Eliza's story, it's worth sitting for a moment with the wider picture. Because this wasn't one woman's private misfortune. This was an entire, quietly enormous shadow economy, running underneath respectable Victorian life the way plumbing runs beneath a house. Nobody spoke of it at dinner parties. Everybody, in some sense, knew it was there. Historians who have combed through the surviving newspapers estimate that in London alone, during the busiest years of this trade, there may have been anywhere from several hundred to well over 1,000 infants being cared for, under these private, informal arrangements at any given time. Multiply that across England's other growing industrial cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and you begin to understand the scale of it. This wasn't a rare tragedy tucked into a corner of history. It was closer to a system, an entire quiet infrastructure that absorbed the babies that respectable society had no place for. And the women who ran these homes, the baby farmers, as the newspapers eventually coldly named them, were not, at first glance, monstrous. That's perhaps the hardest and most human part of this story to sit with. Many of them were exactly what their advertisements claimed. Married, working-class women, often with children of their own, who took in 1 or 2 extra infants to help make ends meet in a household where the husband's wage alone wasn't enough. For these women, a few shillings a week for minding a baby was simply honest work, no different in their minds from taking in washing or piecework, sewing. Picture one of these ordinary homes for a moment. A small kitchen, a fire that needs feeding every few hours, a kettle that's never quite off the boil, a baby's basket tucked into the corner nearest the warmth. The woman of the house, call her a Mrs. Harding, a composite of many real women, whose names appear only briefly in old parish records, might be minding her own 3 children, alongside 2 or 3 infants left in her care, all under the age of 1. There is a particular rhythm to a house like this. The creak of a rocking chair, the low murmur of a lullaby, sung more from habit than sentiment, the smell of watered milk warming on the stove. It's worth pausing on that phrase, watered milk, because it sits at the very center of why this story turns dark. Fresh cow's milk, in this era, was expensive and difficult to keep from spoiling, especially in a poor household without reliable ice or refrigeration. Many carers, out of simple economic necessity, thinned the milk with water to make it stretch further across more mouths and more days. Add to that the fact that infant formula, in any modern sense, simply didn't exist. What existed instead was something called pap, a thin, cheap paste of bread or flour softened in water or weak milk, sometimes sweetened, often not, spooned into babies who, medically speaking, needed something far richer to thrive. It's a small, quiet detail, and it sounds almost mundane when you say it plainly. Watered milk, bread paste, and yet historians studying infant mortality statistics from these homes have found death rates that should stop any listener cold. In the very worst-run establishments, sometimes 8, 9, even 10 infants out of every 10 placed there, gone before their first birthday. Some carers were honestly ignorant of infant nutrition, doing their poor best with poor knowledge in a world before pediatric medicine existed in any recognizable form. Others, and this is where the story grows harder to hold gently, understood the numbers perfectly well and let them work in their favor. Because remember, Mrs. Wilkins' terms moderate, the lump sum adoption fee. If a carer had already been paid £10 to take a baby permanently, and that baby did not survive the year, there was, in the coldest possible arithmetic, no further cost to the carer, no more milk to buy, no more mouths at the table, just one bed, one basket, one set of tiny clothes, free again for the next arrival and the next fee. You can hear how quiet this cruelty is. It doesn't announce itself. It never needed a raised voice, or a locked door, or a single dramatic moment. It only needed neglect. Patient, unremarkable, everyday neglect, and time. Eliza's letter reaches Mrs. Wilkins on a Tuesday. The reply comes back within the week, in a careful, looping hand, on paper that smells faintly of snuff and lavender water. Dear Madam, I would be glad to take your little one in. My own are grown and gone, and I have love to spare. £10 settles all, and you need never trouble yourself further. Yours respectfully, E. Wilkins. £10, roughly equivalent in the working days of a servant to nearly a year's wages saved and handed over all at once. Eliza doesn't have £10 sitting in a drawer. She borrows some, sells a coat that was a gift once, from a life that no longer exists, and pawns a small ring that had belonged to her own mother. She meets Mrs. Wilkins on a Thursday, at a railway station on the edge of the city, because this was the custom. Public, brisk, over quickly, so that neither woman had to sit too long with what was actually happening. Steam curls up along the platform. A guard's whistle sounds somewhere down the line. Mrs. Wilkins is exactly as advertised. Plain bonnet, kind enough smile, a shawl the color of dried moss, pulled snug against the damp, Eliza hands over the child, and the money, and a small folded paper with the baby's Christian name written on it. In case anyone should ever ask, nobody ever did. She watches Mrs. Wilkins walk off down the platform, the small bundle held against a stranger's shoulder, until the crowd swallows them both. The train she herself needs to catch, back to whatever room she's renting now, pulls in a few minutes later, and she boards it, and that, as far as any official record is concerned, is the entire ordinary end of the story. Still cold on that platform, still raining somewhere far off past the glass roof, still just one woman doing what the world had left her to do. But what happened inside Mrs. Wilkins's small house on the edge of the city, in the weeks and months that followed that quiet handshake at the station, was something the neighbors would only begin to whisper about much later, once they noticed how very often a new baby seemed to arrive, and how very rarely any of them seemed to stay. It started, the neighbors would later say, with the washing line. Mrs. Wilkins hung out an unusual number of tiny gowns and flannel wraps for a woman whose own children were supposedly grown. And yet, month after month, the little garments on that line seemed to belong to different babies. Never quite the same size, never quite the same face at the window. New arrivals came and went with a rhythm that struck at least one neighbor, an older widow 2 doors down, who noticed such things because she had little else to do but notice, as somehow too quick. Too quiet. Nobody said anything. Not yet. This is important to understand about this whole chapter of history. Suspicion moved slowly and politely through Victorian streets. A working-class widow did not march up to another woman's door and accuse her of anything. She simply watched and wondered, and perhaps mentioned it once, in passing, to the woman who sold her bread. So let's rest there for a moment, in that small, ordinary uncertainty, before we go further in, to understand how a house like Mrs. Wilkins could operate for years without real interference. You have to understand something about Victorian England that feels almost foreign to us now. There was, for most of this era, no real system checking on where infants went once they left their mother's arms. No birth-to-death tracking, no home visits, no social worker knocking gently to ask how the baby was feeding, how much weight it had gained, whether the room was warm enough. A private arrangement between 2 women, one paying, one caring, was considered exactly that, private. A domestic matter, the same as any other household arrangement, no different in the eyes of the law from hiring a washerwoman or a charwoman. This is, in some sense, the quiet engine that made the whole trade possible. Not any single villain, but an entire absence, a gap in the machinery of the state, wide enough for thousands of small lives to slip through it, one at a time, almost unnoticed. Listen to the sound of an ordinary evening in a house like this, and you'll hear how easily that absence hid itself. A fire settling in the grate with a soft collapse of embers, a kettle's low whistle rising and falling, somewhere upstairs, the thin, tired cry of an infant, and then quiet again, the particular quiet of a baby that has simply grown too weak to cry for very long. Doctors of the era, when they were called at all, and they very often were not, might record a death as wasting, or debility, or the era's catch-all phrase, failure to thrive. These were not lies, exactly. They were simply the honest medical vocabulary of a time that hadn't yet connected watered milk and neglect to the outcome so plainly. A baby that isn't properly fed will indeed waste away. The doctor's certificate wasn't wrong. It simply never asked the question underneath the question. Why was this particular baby in this particular house wasting away at exactly the same rate as the last 3 before it? And here's a detail that tends to surprise people once you sit with it. Registering an infant death in this era cost very little and required almost no scrutiny. A parent or carer could report a death to the local registrar, receive a death certificate for a matter of pence, and arrange a simple burial. Sometimes what was grimly nicknamed a parish funeral, the cheapest possible service. Sometimes several tiny coffins sharing the cost of a single undertaker's visit. The whole process, from a baby's last breath to its burial in unmarked or shared ground, might take no longer than a day or two and draw no attention whatsoever. It's a strange thing to picture if you let yourself sit in it a moment. An infant's entire existence, beginning and ending, moving through the world so quietly that almost no official document beyond a few pences worth of paperwork ever noted it had happened at all. Now, not every baby farmer was Mrs. Wilkins. Not every house on that quiet street ran on watered milk and convenient indifference. It's worth pausing here to hold both truths at once, gently, the way this whole story asks us to. There were, by every honest historical account, carers who did their genuinely best with what little they had. Women who fed their charges as well as they fed their own children, who rocked them through fevers, who grieved real losses when illness, real, unavoidable illness, in an age before vaccines or antibiotics, took a baby anyway, despite good care. Infant mortality across all of Victorian England, in every household rich or poor, married or not, was heartbreakingly high by our standards. Roughly 1 in 5 babies across the whole country didn't survive to their first birthday, even in perfectly loving homes. That's simply the medicine of the era, or rather, the lack of it. So it would be unfair and untrue to paint every single woman who took in another's child for a few shillings a week as a villain. Most were not. Most were poor women trying to stretch a poor income a little further, doing a difficult job under difficult conditions, in a world that offered very little help to anyone. But within that wide or ordinary population of working carers, there existed a smaller, darker current. Women who understood the specific economics we discussed in the last section, and who let those economics guide their hands rather than their hearts. Women who took in payment after payment, adoption after adoption, and who, whether through calculated intention or a kind of numb, practiced indifference, simply let the babies in their care fail, one after another, because a failed baby, once the lump sum was paid, cost nothing further to maintain. This is the part of the story that the newspapers of the 1870s and 1880s eventually could not look away from, however politely Victorian society preferred to avert its eyes. Because eventually, in certain houses, the numbers grew too impossible to explain away as simple bad luck. Too many babies. Too many small quiet deaths, one after another, in the same rooms, under the same roof. Let's step, gently, into one particular house. Not Mrs. Wilkins's, but one that history remembers with rather more detail. Because eventually, its true nature could no longer stay hidden behind a washing line and polite silence. Picture a rented set of rooms above a shop, somewhere on the outskirts of a growing English town. The woman who ran it, we'll simply call her the nurse, since that was the gentle, trusted title such women often gave themselves in their newspaper advertisements, had, by this point in her long career, taken in dozens upon dozens of infants over the years. Some she genuinely nursed and later returned to mothers who'd saved enough to reclaim them. Others, placed with the lump sum adoption fee, she never intended to nurse at all in any real sense. Picture her morning routine, because it's the ordinariness of it that carries the real weight of this story. A kettle set to boil, a thin gruel stirred in a chipped pan, perhaps 3 or 4 infants in the house at any one time, laid in baskets along a single wall, swaddled tightly, tight swaddling being not just custom, but convenient, since a well-wrapped baby who couldn't easily move required far less watching. There's a particular, terrible efficiency to a room like this. The tight cloth, the thin gruel, the quiet. Some historians who've studied surviving case records use a phrase that sounds almost too gentle for what it describes: slow starvation dressed as care. The baby was fed, technically on paper in the loosest sense of the word, just not nearly enough, and not nearly often enough to actually thrive. And a baby too weak to cry loudly is, from a purely practical standpoint, a baby that draws far less attention from neighbors or landlords. Weeks would pass this way, sometimes months, and then quietly, in the night, or in the gray hour just before a house properly wakes, one more small breath would simply stop. And the nurse, practiced by now in the whole sad procedure, would walk to the registrar's office the following morning, pay her few pence, and note the cause exactly as so many doctors had taught her to phrase it: wasting, debility, failure to thrive. And then, within a week or two, sometimes sooner, a new advertisement would run in a fresh edition of the newspaper. A respectable married woman wishes to adopt a child. Every care and attention. Terms moderate. The same words. Almost exactly the same words that Eliza herself once read, in the last chapter of our story, by candlelight, in a cold room, believing she was choosing safety for her child. It's a heavy thing to sit with, how the very same gentle advertisement, the very same reassuring phrase, could describe both a genuinely loving home and a room where babies were quietly, patiently, allowed to fade. There was no way from the outside, from a single sheet of newspaper, to tell which kind of house you were writing to. Still quiet, still ordinary, still, to any outside eye, simply one more small household getting by. But it was precisely this, the terrible sameness of the advertisements, page after page, week after week, across every English town, that would eventually catch the eye of the one kind of person Victorian society hadn't quite expected to go looking. A handful of persistent ordinary citizens, and eventually the reporters and reformers who finally began asking the uncomfortable question underneath all those terms moderate. Namely, moderate compared to what, exactly, and moderate for how long? It began, as so many quiet reckonings do, with someone simply doing their job a little too carefully. A local registrar in a modest English town, the kind of clerk who spends his days copying names and dates into heavy leather ledgers and rarely looks up from the page, noticed something odd one autumn: the same address appearing again and again, each time beside a different infant's name, each time followed within a matter of weeks by another small entry in the death column. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse, he simply did what careful clerks do. He made a note in the margin and mentioned it quietly to a colleague. And that quiet mention is where our story's final turn begins. Let's rest here a moment before we go further, because it's worth understanding just how slowly Victorian England moved towards losing what had been happening in plain sight for decades. The trade in adopted infants wasn't secret, exactly. Everyone who read a newspaper had seen the advertisements. Everyone who lived on a working-class street had at some point noticed a neighbor's baskets of infants coming and going. What was missing wasn't awareness. What was missing was anyone with the authority and the will to ask the harder question underneath the ordinary one. Not simply, where did this baby go? But, and after it arrived, then what? That question, when it finally came first from journalists rather than judges. A handful of reporters in the 1860s and 1870s, working for papers eager for a story that would sell copies, began doing something almost nobody had thought to do before. They answered the advertisements themselves, posing as unmarried mothers or as go-betweens acting on a mother's behalf. They wrote to the very same respectable married woman terms moderate notices that filled the classified columns every week, and then, rather than sending a baby, they simply watched and asked questions and wrote down what they found. What they found, in house after house, was not always horror. Sometimes it was exactly as advertised: a modest, loving home, a carer doing her honest best, but often enough to build a pattern too large to dismiss, They found houses like the nurses. Baskets crowded 3 and 4 to a room. Infants far too thin, far too quiet, far too still for their age. Carers who could not quite say, when pressed gently, how many babies had passed through their care over the years, nor account for where all of them had gone. One investigation, published across several installments in a London weekly, described visiting a house where the reporter counted, over the course of just a few visits, 5 different infants arriving, and not one of them still present, nor accounted for, within 2 months. The article didn't shout either. It simply laid the numbers out, plainly, the way a ledger lays out numbers, and let the reader's own arithmetic do the rest. It's a strange kind of courage, if you think about it. Not the loud kind, not the kind with a raised voice or a dramatic confrontation, but the patient kind. Sitting quietly in someone else's parlor, drinking a cup of weak tea, and simply counting. The reporting did what reporting sometimes manages to do, slowly and imperfectly. It made a private everyday arrangement suddenly, uncomfortably, a public conversation. Letters poured into the newspapers. Some readers were horrified. Others, and this is a detail that tends to surprise people when they first hear it, were more troubled by the immorality of unmarried mothers than by the fate of the infants themselves, which tells you something true, and a little sad about which tragedy Victorian society found easier to be angry about. But eventually, Parliament, moving at the careful, unhurried pace Parliaments tend to move at, even when lives are plainly at stake, took notice. In 1872, a piece of legislation called the Infant Life Protection Act was passed. It required, for the first time, that anyone caring for more than one infant under a certain age, for payment, register with the local authorities. Homes could, in theory, be inspected. Deaths in such homes were meant to be reported with more scrutiny than a simple few pence at the registrar's window. It's tempting, hearing this, to imagine the story ending neatly there. Law passed, problem solved, credits roll. But history rarely closes so tidily, and this particular chapter didn't either. The 1872 Act, as well-intentioned as it was, had gaps wide enough to make a Victorian lawyer wince. It only applied to carers minding more than one infant at a time. So a woman taking in just a single baby, one at a time, one after another, fell entirely outside its reach. Inspections, where they existed at all, were sporadic, underfunded, and easy for a determined carer to prepare for in advance, the same way you might tidy a room before expected company. And the penalties for violation were, by modern standards, almost gentle. Small fines, rarely enforced with any real consistency. So the trade didn't vanish. It simply grew a little more careful, a little more practiced at looking, on the surface, exactly like the honest households it hid among. It would take another 25 years, and a handful of criminal trials shocking enough to finally break through Victorian England's preference for polite silence, before real, teeth-having reform arrived. Picture a courtroom in the 1890s. Wood-panelled, cold despite a small fire in the grate, the public gallery packed shoulder to shoulder with onlookers who'd queued for hours outside. This was no longer a quiet newspaper column read over breakfast. This was front-page news, the kind that made even respectable households, who'd never once thought about baby farming, suddenly unable to think of anything else. The details that emerged from these trials. Details of infants found, of carers who had taken dozens upon dozens of lump-sum payments over the years, of a trade in tiny lives, conducted with the same brisk practicality as any other small business, were plain enough and numerous enough that no polite silence could hold against them any longer. You have to imagine the particular quiet of a Victorian courtroom at the reading of a verdict. No cameras, no noise beyond the rustle of the public gallery leaning forward as one, the creak of old wood, a single cough echoing off high ceilings, and then a magistrate's voice, measured and grave, the words the room had been waiting hours to hear. It's a heavy scene to sit with, and we won't dwell in its darkest specifics longer than we need to. This is a bedtime story, after all, and even hard truths deserve to be told gently. What matters for our purposes tonight is simply this. These trials, more than any newspaper column before them, finally made it impossible for Parliament to look away. In 1897, a new Infant Life Protection Act was passed, tighter, broader, with real registration requirements, real inspection powers, and penalties with actual teeth behind them. It wasn't perfect. Reform rarely is the first time, or even the second. But it was the beginning of something that had never properly existed before in England. A system, however imperfect, actually watching over the babies that unmarried mothers, out of desperation rather than unkindness, had once had nowhere else to send. So what became of Eliza and the small bundle she handed to Mrs. Wilkins on that rainy platform, all the way back at the start of our story? History, as it so often does with women like her, doesn't give us a tidy answer. We don't know, and can't know, whether her particular child was among the fortunate ones, raised, however humbly, in a home that kept its gentle promise, or among the many who simply vanished from the record within a year, one small wasting among thousands of others. What we do know is that Eliza herself, like tens of thousands of women across Victorian England, carried on, found new work eventually, perhaps married in time, and had other children she was permitted, by circumstance and by law, to keep and raise openly. Perhaps she thought of that rainy platform often. Perhaps, in the particular way grief settles into people who have no space left to grieve loudly, she thought of it only in quiet, unguarded moments. The sound of a train whistle somewhere in the distance, a certain shade of moss-green wool, a stranger's kind enough smile, still a mother in her own quiet way, still carrying what she carried, long after the world had moved on and stopped asking. And it's there, in that quiet, unresolved not knowing, that we'll rest for now, before turning, in our final chapter tonight, toward what came after, toward the slow, imperfect century that followed, toward how a nation that once let its most vulnerable little ones vanish so easily into newspaper columns and watered milk, began, haltingly, to build something better in their place. Let's return, gently, to where we began tonight. A rainy platform, a young woman, a stranger with a kind and false smile, and a small bundle passing from one set of arms into another. We've walked a long way from that platform since then, through cold kitchens and careful ledgers, through newspaper columns and courtroom benches. But it's worth coming back to it now at the end, because that single quiet moment is really the heart of everything we've talked about tonight. Not villainy, not cruelty for its own sake. Just a young mother, out of options, trusting a stranger, because trusting a stranger was the only door left open to her. So let's stay there a little longer this time. Let the rain fall softly around us. Let the steam from the train drift up past the platform roof and disappear. And let's talk, gently, about everything that came after, for the country, and for women like her, in the long, slow century that followed. The Infant Life Protection Act of 1897 didn't end the practice of paid infant care overnight, and it would be dishonest of this story to pretend it did. Change, especially the kind that has to reach into thousands of ordinary kitchens, across an entire country, moves slowly and unevenly, and often disappoints the very reformers who fought hardest for it. But something did shift in the years that followed. Local authorities, however understaffed, began keeping proper registers of who was minding infants and where. Inspectors, a handful at first, more as the decades passed, began actually knocking on doors, actually counting baskets, actually asking the plain, patient question that had gone unasked for so long. How many babies have passed through this house, and where, exactly, did each of them go? Death rates in registered homes, where records survive well enough for historians to compare them, did begin to fall, not overnight and not to anything we'd consider acceptable today, but measurably, steadily, across the early years of the 20th century. It's a small, unglamorous kind of progress, no grand parade, just slightly fuller ledgers of babies who lived, sitting quietly alongside the older ledgers of babies who hadn't, and alongside the law, something else began, slowly, to change too, something harder to legislate, but perhaps just as important. Attitudes, ever so gradually, toward unmarried mothers themselves began to soften, at least in certain corners of English society. Charitable homes for fallen women as the era's uncomfortable phrase went, began offering mothers a chance to keep and raise their infants themselves, rather than surrendering them entirely to a stranger's care. Some of these homes were run with genuine warmth. Others, if we're honest, carried their own rigid judgments and hardships. Victorian compassion, even at its best, rarely arrived without a few sharp edges still attached. But it was, in its imperfect way, a step toward something Eliza herself never had the chance to reach for. The possibility of keeping her own child and still surviving. It's worth sitting, for just a moment longer, with the ordinary women on both sides of this story. Because history has a way of flattening people into simple roles, villain or victim, when the truth, as it so often is, was quieter and more tangled than that. The mothers who handed their babies to strangers on cold platforms were not careless, and they were not unloving. They were women squeezed by a world that offered them almost no other path. No wage that could support a child alone, no sympathy from employers, no safety net beneath them at all. Their choice, if you can even call something made under such pressure a true choice, was rarely between a good option and a bad one. It was between two difficult, narrow doors, and they walked through the one that seemed, in that desperate moment, slightly less narrow than the other. And the carers, too. Even the ones who let their small charges fade through neglect rather than malice, were, in most cases, ordinary women shaped by an ordinary poverty of their own. Not extraordinary monsters, but people worn down by a system that offered them too precious few honest ways to earn a living. That doesn't excuse what happened in the worst of these houses. It simply asks us, gently, to hold the whole picture, a system built from thousands of small, understandable choices, each one reasonable on its own, that together produced something none of the individual people involved would likely have chosen had any of them been given a wider door to walk through instead. This is, perhaps, the quietest and truest lesson tucked inside tonight's story. Cruelty in history rarely wears an obvious face. Far more often, it wears the face of ordinary people, doing ordinary arithmetic inside a system that has quietly decided certain lives. The lives of unmarried mothers, the lives of their infants, simply don't count for quite as much as everyone else's. Somewhere, in a small English churchyard, whose name has long since faded from any record, there are still, if you knew exactly where to look, a scattering of very old, very small graves. Some marked, many not. Infants who passed through this whole quiet chapter of history, and who never had the chance to grow into anyone the world would remember by name. We don't get their names tonight. History, in its own quiet unfairness, didn't keep them. But it feels right, before we close, to simply sit with the fact of them for a moment. Small lives, brief and largely unrecorded, that were nonetheless real, and loved, if only briefly, by mothers who had no better door to walk through. And it feels right, too, to remember Eliza. Not as a symbol, not as a lesson, but simply as a young woman standing on a platform in the rain, doing the very best she could with an impossibly narrow set of choices, the way so many ordinary people, across so much of history, have quietly had to do, still uncertain. Still hopeful, in whatever small way a person can be hopeful after a moment like that. Still, in her own quiet way, a mother. And that, friends, brings us gently to the end of tonight's story. If it kept you company for a little while tonight, if it gave your mind somewhere soft and quiet to rest, instead of the usual noise of the day, you're welcome to like this video, or subscribe for the next one. Only if it felt worth it, though. No pressure at all. Some stories are simply meant to be shared quietly between us, and that's more than enough. The rain has stopped now. Somewhere far off past that old platform, the steam has long since drifted away into the evening air. And wherever you are tonight, under your blanket, lights low, eyes growing heavier with every passing minute, you can let all of it go now. The stories, the numbers, the names history never quite kept. None of it needs you awake any longer. Just the quiet. Just the dark, settling gently around you like a well-worn blanket. Just rest, now, waiting patiently for you, the way it always has. Sleep well, friends, still warm, still safe, still simply yours.